It does. It says live, so.
Again, hopefully, okay, Nanga Nadza Talaza Nita Tsekesti. Let's just make sure that we are online now. I'm gonna check this. Yes, Hungan, Mercury being in retrograde. Make sure that we are all right. Okay. Half a day, Hamzo Todos. Ay day. Dispensadzo, we've had some technical difficulties for today's episode, but we are finally online. We are live streaming. Buenas and half a day. Guawi host Midzu Tatlo. Palestina episode Fanachu. I'm once again your host for Fanachu. My name is Michael Luhan Bavakwa, and I'm very excited for today's episode and the conversation we're going to have. Kyle Galindez is a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz. He's also a published author. He writes some creative works, which you can definitely check out. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about those as well today. But the main focus is urban development and the U.S. military in Guam since World War II. And so this is a very, very, very important topic because the time in which my grandparents grew up, sort of Guam as an urban space simply did not exist. To then go from when my mother was growing up to when I was growing up, the changes that dramatically happen sort of in the lives of Chamorros that happened very dramatically to sort of the landscape on the island, the resources, the environment, all of these things. The 20th century Guam history is one of rapid change and development. And oftentimes we think about that in positivistic terms, like, oh, this is sort of the march of progress on this island. We rarely, unfortunately, think about the role that urban development that it might play in terms of colonialism, militarism, imperialism. Guam is a territory, a colony, a non-self-governing territory of the United States. And so we have to remember that everything that comes to Guam from the United States comes with some of those dimensions to it. And so I'm very excited that Kyle will be sharing with us his research today. And Hafaday, Kyle, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you since before technically I haven't seen you, but I'm Zoom seeing you since before the pandemic.
Yeah. It's really, really great to see you. It's been 2 years. Half a day, Miguel, and to all the listeners.
All right. And so Kyle, I want you to get right into your presentation. And then I'm looking forward to getting some questions from our viewers as well. And then I have some too. But whenever you're ready, go ahead and get started. Talk to us about urban development, militarism in Guam since World War II.
Great. Let me share my screen. How is this?
Looks good, Maulik.
Great. Yeah, so thanks again for having me on. My name is Kyle Galindez, and yeah, like you said, I'm working on a PhD in sociology at UC Santa Cruz. I'm kind of interested in thinking about urbanization and environmental issues and all of this in relation to imperialism and militarism. Just a little bit about kind of my own connection to Guam. I was born there, actually. I did not grow up there. But my family was Filipino and ended up moving to Ohio. So that was where I grew up. But I was very fortunate to have made some research trips to Guam, and that was how I met Miket. I did a lot of researching at UOG down on the Mark, attending protests and rallies and marches and things like that. But a lot of my time was spent, down on the archives and trying to research some of these questions, and also interviewing people on Guam and trying to hear their stories and listen to them as well. So this first slide, and I realize for the listeners, you won't see the slides, but I'll try to describe things as we go along. I'll be sharing some photos and scans I found from the archives. On the left is just an image of some of the post-war reconstruction from or sorry, of the military's kind of construction efforts in World War II, and I had some really interesting snippets of photos to share from that. The right is a interesting document I found from 1959. This is titled Authorizing the Secretary of the Navy to acquire certain land on the island of Guam. And this was a document produced for the House of Representatives. Fascinating to me, though, is this line at the bottom, and it says, the need for the legislation. And the first line says, a primary road system was constructed by the Navy on Guam during and immediately following World War II under emergency conditions and without concern for the ownership of the land involved. So, I mean, it's just fascinating to see in their own language, without concern for the ownership of the land involved. So, partly what my research digs into is trying to find these deeper connections between, thinking urban development in a broad sense. So here we're talking about building a road system, right? And how this is going to relate to US militarism and what I will call imperialism. And just to kind of, give a sense of how, how they are thinking about the place too. So, without concern for the ownership of the land involved. I mean, really, really stunning. So I'll jump into some things here. So before I get into Guam history specifically, I want to start with talking about some of the big picture ideas that kind of informed my research from a kind of like larger geographic scale. And what I'll be presenting is just kind of a snippet of my dissertation research, which is trying to look at several decades in history, but going back to World War II to start. We are usually taught that the United States was the greatest force for good in World War II, and they were, they portray themselves as saving the world, and that's often kind of what we're taught. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on in terms of the geopolitical games the United States was playing with allies and its enemies. And critical historians, of course, have found that the US had a intense self-interest, right, in its participation in World War II, in that they were aiming to create a kind of American-led world order, right, an American-led global order, which would replace the British Empire as the kind of leading capitalist, nation at that time. By the end of the war, it was clear that the British Empire was wrecked, and the United States' major industrial rivals, Japan and Germany, were also destroyed, right? So you had this situation where in the State Department, in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, they are seeing an opportunity to kind of, to position the United States as the most powerful and leading country in the world. So you had individuals like Secretary of State Dean Acheson, they're wanting to boost American exports right around the world, because again, the whole world was, wrecked, and so American manufacturing was something like half of global output by that time, right? So huge opportunities for growing American reach into markets overseas, into growing corporate profits at home. There was an effort to try to break up the British Empire to make room for a new American system, which Churchill was very upset about. Actually, Roosevelt and Churchill fought about this. There's a funny quote where Roosevelt says something like, we're gonna have more trouble dealing with the British than we are with the Germans. So new systems of trade, of global regulation, of finance, things like that, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, right? These sorts of things are being pushed by the United States to kind of secure this kind of new American, global order. Different functions of the world were assigned, different places in the world were assigned different functions. So, parts of Southeast Asia were designated as spaces that would provide raw materials. Western Europe and Japan were designated to be allied to the United States. But why? The biggest threat to this kind of, this new kind of global capitalist order of nation states that would be headed by the United States was, of course, the Soviet Union. And that was a threat. This required the maintenance of a kind of worldwide network of military bases, even though the war had ended. So this is, of course, where Guam comes in terms of its role in this kind of new remaking of the world order at the end of World War II. And again, passing from the British Empire to the United States. And so to maintain this kind of military power in the Pacific in terms of containing the Soviet Union there, the Navy works intensely to maintain Guam's colonial status at this time. This includes through manipulating the United Nations, through dealing with various people in Congress and the White House. Interestingly, the United Nations Trusteeship Council was formed, and this was specifically to implement self-determination for 11 trusteeships around the world. The United States ensured that the Micronesian trusteeship would be put under the UN Security Council. This is where the United States has veto power, right? Not to a general vote. The United States compromises with the Soviet Union actually over some islands north of Japan, and they allowed the Americans to keep ownership of Micronesia. This leads to the trust territory of the Pacific, but which actually did not need to include Guam because the Navy already was managing it. So I just kind of mentioned these things here to kind of give the kind of big picture idea of what I'm thinking of as imperialism, which one definition says, we could think of imperialism as states restricting the self-determination of other states or peoples, right? Of which colonialism is a form. So just some really, really fascinating quotes that I pulled out that just kind of reveal the way that state leaders are, thinking about islands and places like Guam and the places that they want to militarize around the world. A quote from Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, he says, "We cannot allow ourselves to be charged with imperialism," end quote. And that he's speaking about 130 Pacific islands that they retained at the end of the war. And he says, "The chance may never come again for a comprehensive far-flung chain of bases." Then he goes on to say, "None of the islands in question possesses natural features of value from other than the military standpoint, and therefore cannot constitute territorial aggrandizement." So basically, they had control over 130 Pacific islands at the end of the war. And this is them rationalizing how to keep control of them. He's saying, well, actually, since there's no natural features of value on this island, we can't be accused of imperialism, right? And again, this is at the same time they're forcing the British Empire to let go of their possessions, right? So they're obviously very self-aware of this kind of contradiction. In 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson argues that islands, quote, "are not colonies, they are outposts, and their acquisition are appropriate under the general doctrine of self-defense." So again, this kind of rationalization. Later in the 1950s, Assistant Director of the Navy Stu Barber, he works to develop something called this strategic island concept, right? They were actually concerned about decolonization efforts, right, which were going to be sweeping the world in the 60s and 70s in other countries. So they had a strategy of trying to build military bases on islands as fast as possible, and they claim, quote, "Remote colonial islands with small colonial populations would be the easiest to acquire and would entail the least political headaches." So again, just kind of like some big picture stuff to think about, how the militarization of Guam and how the urban development that kind of follows, how this really fits into these kind of large scale geopolitical, games that so much prevent people on Guam from having sovereignty, from having self-determination, over the future of land on the island. So one last thing I did want to say too, they also had plans to construct. Initially, they wanted to build about 53 bases, stretching from Alaska all the way down to Australia, right? This kind of, this huge network across the Pacific. And part of the idea that they state is that well, if the Soviet Union launches nuclear weapons, it will hit a place like Guam first, and then that will give everybody else on the mainland a lot of time to prepare, right? And that's literally how they're thinking about this, right? The islands are treated as pawns to play with, as something to sacrifice. Well, if it gets nuked, at least we can tell the people on the mainland to get ready. But anyway, I was really interested though in trying to connect this kind of realm of things into what's happening with urban development on Guam at the end of the war. So I was interested to find that according to the U.S. Census of 1940, about half of Guam's population lives in Agenya, actually. So about half. But thinking about how did Guam change from a situation like that to today, right, where of course there's not half the island living in Agenya anymore. The U.S. in the run up to recapturing the island from the Japanese, they bombed the island for 13 days straight. Many buildings in Agenya are destroyed. I found that of 3,286 dwelling places on the island, about 80% of them are destroyed. And I have up here just kind of a reminder, like this is happening against this backdrop where, the US Navy was intensely in control since 1898, right? Which kind of had this effect of preventing a independent civilian economy from developing, right? So a fascinating quote I have up here too, from US Admiral Nimitz, as he's declaring July 21st Liberation Day. He says, "All powers of government and jurisdiction in Guam and adjacent waters and over the inhabitants thereof, and final administrative responsibility are vested in me as Admiral, the United States Navy, commanding the forces of occupation and as military governor, and will be exercised through subordinate commanders by my direction. No political activity will be permitted other than that authorized by me or under my authority." So, Mika, I know you've of course been very, very, critical of this, and we should. I mean, this is called Liberation Day, but if you hand somebody true freedom, you say, do what you want. It's in your hands now, up to you. Here he's saying no political activity will be permitted other than that authorized by me or under my authority. I mean, could you imagine? So, but let's move on. These were some documents that I found when I was researching at UOG down in the Mark. These were photos taken by the naval construction workers and engineers. It was some kind of like Pacific diary, made by Seabees, they were called. But it's showing some of the devastation of the city of Agenya, and you can just see how so much of it was bombed out and just destroyed. That picture in the middle on the right, especially, people who have seen photos of nuclear blasts hitting a city. I mean, that's like what that looks like. So just some pictures here. I also found that when they were moving into the city, there was fear that Japanese soldiers were hiding in the buildings, so they just blew them up. Let's see. Some other photos I found here, a little bit on the left of kind of what life was like for many people. On the right, though, it's fascinating to see this contrast here. So you see temporary homes. It says natives using whatever was at hand. And at the bottom, there's a picture of like a nice looking place, temporary homes built by our forces. But, those homes were destroyed by them in the first place, so I don't know, just something to think about here. So anyway, moving into urban development following the war, right? So, for most people in urban studies, when you're thinking about the growth of the city, we often go back to the Industrial Revolution and thinking about growth and productivity and factories and huge populations clustering. It's this kind of like industrial story. But this is different, of course, in Guam, because that was not permitted to happen when you had colonial control for hundreds of years. But a lot is going on with the reconstruction of Agenya, and I'll kind of get into some of that now. But it's important to mention too that so much of the military development was made possible because so many people were displaced, right? And I'm sure as the listeners know, 1,350 families were displaced, around 11,000 people total. This is about half the island, and I was indebted to Anne Hattori's work on some of this. Lots of land taken even for recreational purposes, right? So the Navy and the Air Force are seizing lots of land on the island, partly for military construction, and then partly, for things like a golf course. Military funding is pouring into the island, and including for a lot of construction projects. So, they built Marine Drive to connect the bases. And once again, from that document, remember, building these roads without concern for the land involved, right? So this is a space that is supposed to be liberated, that is also being told, hey, we're going to build roads and military stuff everywhere, and we're going to kick people out of their old villages and move them into the new, right? There's a lot of, terrible things going on here. And part of what this involves is an effort on the Navy to try to reconstruct and rebuild Agenya. Interestingly, I found that they actually based the new city off of a grid layout based on Santa Monica, California. And again, no regard for the pre-war ownership, which caused all kinds of legal problems. Let's see, I'll move on to the next slide though. But they also retained control over the utilities. They monopolized control of the freshwater. Even tried to take Tumon Bay, but thankfully were stopped by community outcry. This image here comes from a magazine I found down in the Mark called Pacific Profile, and this is from 1965. And it says, new city plan proposed to avoid slums in Agenya. But what really struck me about this is look at the contrast on the left and the right. So you've got pictures of Agenya from 1920. You've got a plan of the city streets from 1818 to 1819, right? Really fascinating to look at, the way that the city was laid out at that time. But you can see the houses are, somewhat, they're densely packed together, right? The neighborhoods look more walkable. It looks more like a kind of clustered, city. And then contrast this to the one on the right, which is the Navy's, rebuilding from 1958 here. At least in this photo, I mean, there's not the dense houses, right? The roadways they're wide, they're built for cars, not for pedestrians. You can see that, the dense houses here are gone. There's a lot of empty space. It's not, that friendly of a place to walk. So this effort was very much, botched. And, I mean, contrast this to how other cities, right, where people have more of a say over what happens, are able to kind of control over time what gets built where, right? Where do we build houses? Where do we build apartments? What's going to be zoned as a business district? Do we put a park here? Do we want roads for people or for cars, right? All of those kinds of choices were denied to people here, or at least, the Navy always had kind of final say over what it was doing. So I kind of just wanted to bring up some of this background here just about Agenya in particular, because I mean, it's really illustrative, of the way that urban development on this island was, in contrast to other places, right, was so caught up in, what the military envisioned the island as, right? So going back to the beginning at the kind of large scale political battles against the Soviet Union, for example, or even thinking, that like, well, if the islands get nuked first, then at least we'll be safe at home. So anyway, I wanted to share a couple other quotes from some documents. So I was curious to see, how is it that people are thinking of urban development then themselves in the 60s and 70s, right? And beyond, what are people on Guam kind of thinking about this? These are really fascinating documents. I encourage reading all of it if you can, but I just pulled out a few snippets. But there was a 1975 conference on urbanization in the Pacific, actually, and I found one participant, Gregorio C. Sanchez. He was special assistant to the governor for planning and budget of the government of Guam. And he says that, well, under naval rule on Guam, no plans were made for the independent development of a civilian economy. The port was closed to foreign flags, and I repeat, the only planning which was implemented was oriented toward defense needs. Later, a 1975 study from the University of Guam says, Guam is changing from rural to urbanized or suburbanized living patterns. And it goes on to say, there is a tendency for settlements to follow highways and utilities to stretch in ribbons across the landscape rather than cluster in the compact village patterns of former times, right? So, you know, if you've got a situation now in the 60s and 70s of suburban sprawl on the island and traffic and congestion and pollution and things like that, I mean, keep in mind that Agana was bombed, you know, it was destroyed. And so another quote here I had was from a master's thesis actually titled Land Use on Guam. And it says, a significant impediment in government planning and policies is the military. It is difficult to assess the impact of federal land on the island's social, economic, and physical systems because of military secrecy concerning present and future projects, right? Moreover, military property in some cases divides established communities, cuts convenient lines of travel from one area to another, and in general limits expansion potential, right? So just kind of a few takeaways here. From, you know, what I had kind of been finding and cataloging, right, about the kind of history of urban development here, right, that the military infrastructures and what they were doing, right, it fractured a lot of communities, led to infrastructures that maybe didn't quite make sense or were confusing because it's serving their needs, right, at this time against the Soviet Union, right, not necessarily the needs of locals. It restricted ability to make decisions about land and development. It also kind of shifts the scale of urban politics in Guam, right? Having to contend with, you know, the Navy, the Air Force, with the Department of the Interior, right, with the federal government. Again, never truly recovered kind of as the urban center, right? It tends to drift upward toward Tumon, especially with the rise of the tourist industry. And yeah, I mean, last point here is that no land use plan was actually developed until 1966. And I learned from talking with folks on Guam that it wasn't actually implemented anyway, right? But I mean, that's kind of a big deal, right? It's not until 1966 are, you know, people are people really permitted to kind of, you know, sit down and develop a land use plan that can suit the needs of residents and civilians in their everyday lives rather than the needs of US imperialism abroad. I've also kind of cataloged some problems I found today that persist that people told me about. So there's problems with the availability and affordability of housing, right, which can be hindered by military populations, include, you know, especially that when they're getting like a rental stipend, right, that drives up the cost of rent. Difficulty in attracting construction workers for local projects, as the military might hire them first. There's of course the unpredictable nature of military spending and future land needs, right? So they might set aside land for environmental protection one day and then 20 years later taking it back to build something else there, right? And this, it of course limits the ability for economic development and environmental protection. So anyway, last slide, I know I went way too long again, sorry, but last slide I had was just some questions to consider, you know, when we think about the future of urban development, not only in Guam, but elsewhere, right? You know, we should ask urbanization, but for whom, for what purposes, under what conditions? You know, I didn't get into it in this presentation because this doesn't, sorry, I didn't have time to present the whole dissertation, right? But there's also the question of tourism, you know, urban development for the tourists or for the residents, you know, that's an important question. We could think about, well, what would the future of urban development on Guam, you know, look like after, let's say, decolonization or even a greater degree of self-determination? I mean, how would we determine the future differently? How will future conflicts, of course, right, like those between US and China, how might that shape urban development? And then also, you know, how can we establish ways to have meaningful community input, right, for these kinds of decisions, and not just to provide input to give comments and be forgotten, right, but to have like a real power to shape the kind of future destinies of, like, you know, the places that we are living. So that was all I had then. Sorry for going on a little bit too long, but yeah, happy to hear if you have any thoughts or questions. Or
Munga masanga now, don't apologize. That was so no. Sidus Masi Kyle, that was a very, very enlightening. I think and I encourage especially those of you who want to get into Guam history, who want to do critical studies about Guam Chamorro issues. That presentation right there is to use a very non-local metaphor, it's a gold mine. I guess I'm trying to think of what a local metaphor would be. It's a pugwa, it's a pugwa find or something, or I don't know. Because what you provided there, Kyle, because this is something that I always like to stress to people, is that our perception and our understanding of our relationship to the United States is only a very small part of our actual relationship to the United States. And so our fantasies or our wishful thinking about the way the United States connects to us, sort of feelings like they recognize patriotism or that they love us because of the red rice, they love us because of the Kelaguen, all of this stuff, that may have very little to do with the reality of what determines and what drives the relationship between Guam and the United States. And we may think that people may think it's the sacrifice of those who serve, and that's what gives us recognition, that's what gives us value. But what you remind us is that it's the strategic location of Guam, and that we should then not sort of accept our own wishful thinking about what Uncle Sam or the military or the United States feels about us. We should do the research and find out what they say, find out what they have written, find out what military planners, commanders, what they have said, because when you had those quotes and when you had that information about sort of the planning for Guam right after the war, and then sort of even some of the issues that persisted after the war in the rebuilding of the island, you can see that so many of those things have a huge fundamental impact on what happens after it. It's not this simple sort of thing where the US military sort of set things up, put this infrastructure and built this foundation, and then now that we can elect a governor, we have a non-voting representative, now those things don't influence or impact us anymore. And I often think people feel that, but sort of your presentation is a reminder that sort of whatever gets buried under us that builds the foundation of us, you can't just simply leave it or ignore it. It'll still influence things. And so so thank you for that. That's why it's totally okay that you went over. I was engrossed especially with some of the quotes that you were sharing. And so we have some questions, and so I wanted to give a chance for you to answer some of our questions. And so this question comes about typhoons. And so Karen and Pamela, huge super typhoons in the 60s and 70s. Sort of what role do you feel that those typhoons played in terms of urban development, in terms of Americanizing Guam, sort of from your perspective, having gone deep into this history? What do you feel is the impact of those typhoons?
Well, I mean, what I had read is that that's kind of another wave of kind of massive urban development is, as the relief money from Karen is kind of, pouring into the island. And so, that also is a factor in terms of, what is getting built and where, and what is getting funded, and, for what purposes. I guess in terms of what role does it play? I mean, it is another kind of wave of urban development. But, it's still under these kinds of conditions of restricted self-determination in some way. You still had the military occupying lots of the land on the island, of course. It's very off limits to build, in certain areas and in certain places. So, I mean, yes, there was a kind of, wave of more urban development, and including building some of the first like true civilian infrastructures following those hurricanes. But I mean, we still need to ask ourselves like, well, what are the, under what kinds of conditions, and what is even possible, given the fact that so much of the island is still being taken up.
Yes, I think when we look at that history, we can see that sort of Guam develops so rapidly, sort of at such an intense sort of pace, but we don't ever sort of question then what did that rapid change and development do in terms of sustainability, in terms of developing, so we can see, for example, that sort of the old style roof, wooden and thatch houses, of course, get replaced, by sort of the concrete houses that we have now. But the question, though, is as we get sort of connected into these new circuits of federal money, these new sort of ways of building, these ways of designing, sort of does that then sort of, where is sustainability in that? Sort of is it just something where the inertia of being connected to this huge United States, the federal government, it just means sort of that we get swept up into things, and then there's sort of rarely the conversations that are mentioned in the last few slides that you shared from the planners, right? That sort of we're just kind of stuck in this matrix, and then there's never any real ability to get out of it. And so, yes, your thoughts on
All
that?
right. Well, I was going to say, I mean, there's also the security clearance that was in place, until 1962 or so, and I was also thinking about things like the Jones Act, for example, that drives up a lot of, like, when you have a community that's rapidly urbanizing and is not as self-sustaining, has left its agricultural production behind, then now you're importing more and more goods. This is true, for most cities. It's not farmland, right? You have to bring in a lot from elsewhere now. And then you think about the Jones Act driving up those prices. So I mean, it's still a situation of this kind of colonial framework through which urbanization and even mass consumption, things like that, is still unfolding.
Yes, and I think I wanted to go back to those quotes that you shared, because I mean, sometimes when people talk to me about, especially sort of angry people on Facebook or on social media, when they talk to me about how, yeah, we could never decolonize, we could never do anything different because we're so dependent upon the United States, or because we take federal money or this or that. I always, the quotes that you shared really reminded me that the plan right after World War II was that precisely that Guam not be self-sustaining. Sort of that any sort of development of the local economy, any development of the island sort of on its own was to be made secondary to the strategic interests of the U.S. military. And I wanted you to kind of, because we've been talking about the Jones Act, we've been talking about, you mentioned sort of food security, food sovereignty. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, sort of that blueprint for dependency that we see coming out of World War II.
Yeah, I mean, well, when you were saying that, I was also thinking about how, this kind of extends to the international arena and the United Nations, in which, the negotiations with other countries, have to go through the United States, for example. So, I mean, that's also another kind of dependency there. Yeah, I mean, some of these quotes, and the way that you put it, that kind of like blueprint of dependency, I think is really, really good. And the question of what could a place survive on its own without somebody ruling over it? I mean, I mean, yes, there other places have decolonized, have they left the British Empire or something. I mean, it's not not at all some kind of unprecedented act or something in history. So But yeah, I mean, I think that, that would, thinking about how that relates to kind of urban development, I'm thinking about this, uh, was it a paper from urban studies, big urban studies guy named David Harvey, and he talks about the right to the city. The the idea that how land and space or urban development is going to be carried out. I mean, who is permitted to do that? Who has the right to actually make those kinds of final decisions? That's a really important question, and um, so I think that, yeah, these questions of like sustainability of dependency. I mean, we always have to keep in mind, um, thinking about who has the right to do these things, and who who should, is it us, or is it, people in Washington DC or something?
Again, Sidzus Masi. And so we have another question. You mentioned, of course, Liberation Day, and sort of the way that you phrased it is not really a real liberation, especially when what happens after it is meant to follow somebody else's interests.
Mm-hmm.
And so this person asks, they've never really heard of Liberation Day or the critique of it framed like that. Sort of usually it's that that Guam isn't given its sovereignty, or it's or that sort of it returns to being a colony, but simply this person has never heard about it framed in that way in terms of development, right? That once the US returns, land displacement, sort of infrastructure development along the US military's interests and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you please sort of talk a little bit more about thinking about liberation in that way? Because because my friend here says that he'd never heard it thought of in that way.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to rewind history and see how it could have been different, but we could consider. I mean, so for example, the way that the Navy botched the reconstruction of Agana, for example, bringing in a street grid pattern from Santa Monica, or buying up land at very, very cheap prices, for example, not respecting pre-war ownership. I mean, I'd imagine all of that would be different, I mean, when I think of, being liberated, I mean, I would imagine that me and my family and fellow neighbors would have, control over what we're doing with our cities and our roads and our homes and our spaces and things like that. So yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about Liberation Day in relation to the kind of urban development, I mean, that quote struck me, just no political activity is authorized except by me. And at the same time, the Navy is gonna, claim that we're gonna modernize and reconstruct the city that we just completely, incinerated. And I mean, I don't know, it just seems to be just, it's difficult to kind of maintain the idea that this was a real freedom that was handed to people.
No, Sidzus Masi. And I think for me, I always try to help people understand that, because it's oftentimes people will reduce colonialism to sort of, is there sort of the worst brutality, atrocities? Do you suffer? And then they try to argue, if you benefit from colonialism, then it can't be colonialism. So many people have made that argument. Well, sort of receiving federal money means that you can't be a colony, because why would the colonizer put money into something that it owns? It's kind of a ridiculous argument when you think about it. But
Yeah.
that's why I always try to reframe things to remind people that having US citizenship doesn't mean that you aren't a non-self-governing territory. Doesn't mean you aren't a colony. Receiving federal funds doesn't mean it either, right? Benefiting from it doesn't mean that you are either. Because even if you look at the United States, when it sort of fought for its own independence, was the United States suffering more horribly than any place in human history, and that's why they rose up and wanted their independence? No. The issue was that they were not genuinely self-governing. is that the issues that you're talking about today, like the basic framework for how you develop yourself, how you control your borders, what you do with your resources, what you do with the land, these were not in the control of colonies and throughout history. And that's kind of what you're talking about here, is that lack of basic control over how this island is going to evolve and develop.
Yeah, I mean, I also think about how, I mean, just that quote from the beginning, you know, the Navy built a roadway without concern for the locals involved, or, you know, something like, I mean, that's, you know, that's, I mean, you know, try to imagine this happening in you know, New York City or something. You know, the Navy moves in, takes 1/3 of the entire city, builds a new roadway, no concern for the locals involved. I mean, we would see a very different trajectory of urban development than in a place like that. You know, so, but no, you're absolutely right, though. I mean, you know, real, you know, self-governing, self-determination. I mean, those are things that you would have control over and would have a say in, right? So, for example, Marine Drive was built to connect the bases primarily, right? And I mean, if you know, if you had, let's say, like a civilian group thinking about where to build roadways at that time, I mean, would it be connecting the bases primarily, you know, or would they, you know, how would it look different? It's impossible. It's hard to say, but you know, we can, you know, imagine it's not going to look like that at least. So, you know.
Oh no, that's a very good point, and we should always ask ourselves that, because you know, we seem to oftentimes be stuck in ruts, you know, and part of it is sort of you inherit these ruts and you kind of do your best to find a place in them, you know, these systems. And so I wanted to we have another question that's come in, and so I don't know how much you've been following sort of recent politics in Guam, but one of our patrons on Patreon, Seska, she asks, how do you see the building of Camp Blas, which is, of course, the Marine Corps base, and the approval of the Vista Del Mar mega development, which is right near Two Lovers Point, affecting the people of Guam? How can we prepare for any negative effects? It seems our political leaders are not preparing for climate resiliency, as the worst of the climate crisis hits us with more flooding, stronger typhoons, and hotter weather. Meanwhile, housing, food, utilities, and healthcare costs continue to rise. And so your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a big question and a lot to think about. I mean, you know, I think that it's challenging to try to think about how to stop big projects, you know, from happening. So the new hotels that are being built by Two Lovers Point that you mentioned, I did see something about that in the news recently, and then also with the new camp for the Marines. I mean, there has to be a point where I think communities can come together and build enough power to say no to things, you know, to say, we've already opened up enough of the island to tourism, and we have the power to say no to this. We've already opened up enough of the island to militarism. We have the power to say no to this. And it's a matter of, you know, achieving that kind of power to organize something like that is very, very, you know, challenging, and it seems daunting. But I mean, history is filled with examples where people do exactly these sorts of things. So I mean, yeah, I don't quite have all the answers about, you know, how to stop those sorts of things, but I mean, you know, I would say look to history for some examples where people did come together and organize and, you know, succeed to stop things like that, if the communities don't want them.
No, Sidus Masi, thank you for that. And Sheska, thank you, Sidus Masi, por ifinaisan mo. I think you bring up a good point that has been sort of a regular one throughout your discussion today, and that is sort of that issue of, you know, in terms of development, who does it serve, right? And so when you mention sort of Marine Drive being the most important road on the island, not because of anything having to do with the people, but because of the need to connect military bases, right? And then we just kind of, and then the society community grows and evolves around that. But it's the same sort of thing with like the Vista Del Mar project is with so many people struggling on island is our like massive fancy luxury condos what the island needs? What is the point of that? For whom is the island developing for?
Yeah,
right.
and so who's gonna
go ahead. I'll put
I'm sorry, I was just gonna say, who's gonna reap the profits from that mostly? I mean, I don't know the particularities of that project. I'm not sure how true this was, but there was, I mean, one person when I was in Guam told me that like only one hotel was actually owned by a local on Guam. I don't know, Miguel, do you know? It was just one. Somebody told me this. So.
Oh yes, yes. The only one is owned by, as far as I know, one group is owned by a family that lives locally on Guam, but the majority of them, no local ownership.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, those kinds of profits are, they're going to leave the island. I mean, it might provide some low wage, jobs, but I mean, that's going to be true for any kind of tourist, economy. But I mean, I think partly it's kind of like shifting the thinking from, how to develop in this kind of way that is almost like non-extractive, if that makes sense. So, the military has its purposes, the tourist industry has its purposes, it's like people are taking a little bit of Guam and turning it into either military power or to money, for big companies far away. And so, I mean, that's kind of the big question then, is how can you achieve a model of development that doesn't rely on this kind of like extractive, kind of logic happening, which is hard to do when you have very restricted self-determination. So, yeah.
So true. No, so true. So true. And I mean, you mentioned, sort of power, sort of leaders, sort of communities rising up on these issues. And that's so key, right? Because in Guam, there is an election this year, and you have to wonder, if, are you going to support leaders who believe in sustainable, affordable housing for the majority of the people on the island? Or are you going to support people who sort of, who still buy into the problematic thinking that whoever wants to give us a suitcase of money, just take my land. Whoever's got the suitcase of money, just take whatever land you want, because we can't survive without you.
Yeah, I mean, there's another way. There's another way forward, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and so Kyle, I've enjoyed this so much, and I do want to remind everybody, especially if you are a grad student or if you are somebody who wants a greater depth of understanding about a pivotal but largely unstudied part of our history, which is that post-war period, right? That's why, Lee, the poet Lee Perez says that Guam's history ends at Liberation Day, because we have so many stories of World War II, the occupation, quote unquote, liberation, and then 6 years vanish and the Organic Act is signed. And so, but that, even in your presentation, you provided some figures, statistics, how many families were displaced, how many Chamorros were displaced, quotes from the military at that time behind their thinking. If you want to understand more about, that critical time in our history, which impacted so much, but we study, unfortunately, so little, because it's trapped between those two, quote unquote, monumental events of liberation and the Organic Act being signed. It complicates the triumphant narrative of progress. So that's why this presentation was so important. And so, Kyle, I want to give you a last sort of a chance to share any final thoughts, and anything you would encourage people to check out.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said was really fascinating about looking at the 6 years, that are often like, if you want to look at real history, look at the parts that, the official textbooks are telling you not to look at or are glossing over or something. You know, if you dig into things beneath the surface, I mean, sometimes it's pretty shocking, the things that, you know, they would prefer us not to know about, or to not. It's so important to try to not just remember, but to discover new things about history too, you know, and to make sure that those things are not forgotten.
Sidus Masi. And remember, for those of you that are patrons of Fanachu on Patreon, we have been doing a series in the Radical Readings where we've been sharing quote unquote internal government documents, studies by the US military. For the last episode of Radical Readings, I shared some WikiLeaks State Department documents.
Oh, fascinating. I should check those out.
So if you are a Patreon a supporter of Fanachu on Patreon, be sure to check those out. But Kyle, Sidus Masitatlu, this was very enlightening, even for me who studies this and talks about this. I still learned quite a bit from your presentation today, and who agradece now. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again.
Hagulokwe, you too. And so para hamzu todos ni umeegad za umeekungok Sidus Masi na uneegad za uneekungok esti na episode Fanachu. Adios. Esta ki manatli hitatlu.